Jason's Weather Window. Going to discuss the November outlook and contemplate winter a little this afternoon. I hope you're good. I hope you've had a nice weekend. The weather's certainly quite wild. It's blustery, coastal gales, heavy showers. It has been a brighter day for much of England and Wales than the previous days. However, it's still feeling a little blustery, and we've got the remnants of Melissa coming our way for tomorrow. So cloud is thickening from the west, and it's bringing rain into Ireland, but it's going to really lift the temperatures. In fact, it's going to be a pretty mild week. And the first week of the month is going to be quite mild. I think temperatures will be about 3 degrees above the seasonal average. And I think there's going to be plentiful amounts of rain, especially in the west. Coastal areas, hilly areas as well, with the southwesterly winds, those mountains, the hills just ringing out the rain, essentially. And we could have a number of inches of rain over a day or 2 days if you are in the firing line with those frontal systems. There will be periods of drier weather as well with some showers, but I think predominantly it's looking pretty unsettled. During week two, I think the unsettled weather will subside a little bit. It's going to remain unsettled, but not quite as windy, not quite as wet as high pressure tries to build up from the south from time to time. It may also build to the east of us and just allow for some drier interludes at times. And when you have a drier, clearer interlude, especially at night time, it could be a little chilly. And I think daytime temperatures as well, just a few degrees down and what we're going to see in the coming week. So unsettled really right until the middle of the month. The transition to slightly less unsettled weather, probably around the 9th or the 10th of the month. And then we're looking towards high pressure, perhaps trying to build in a wee bit more. There's a few drivers, global drivers, and I think the MJO is a big one, the Madden-Julian oscillation. I often talk about that in forecasts. That's why it's nice to do a video now and again because you can explain it. Essentially, the Madden-Julian oscillation, the MJO, is an area of convective thundery activity that circulates the equator. So it's always on the move. Sometimes it's rather suppressed, and other times it's more amplified. And the MJO has been forecast to move into phases 7, 8, and 9 later on in November. Now, usually, when that happens, we see high pressure building more to the north of the country. We've been in a phase 4 and quite an amplified phase 4, and that is really what's driving the jet stream right over us, slightly south displaced, and giving us a lot of windy and wet conditions. But as we move out of that, and the MJO kind of rotates more into the Pacific, but not really making it right into the Pacific, the western side of the Pacific Ocean. It can then affect the jet stream over the Atlantic and allow for some blocking high to become established. I know that's what the forecast models are going for, ECM and the GFS. However, we've got La Nina just now, and those colder waters right in the middle of the Pacific Ocean always kind of inhibit that flow of the MJO from the maritime continent, Indonesia essentially. It kind of prevents it from moving on. So there is a little bit of uncertainty in my mind anyway. However, I would suggest that we will settle down and it could turn a little bit colder. It could turn colder simply because we've got high pressure, and at this time of year when we have clear skies at night, it does become obviously quite frosty, quite cold. So it might become colder for that reason. But if high pressure sets up to the northwest, and every now and again it kind of waxes and wanes, and if it pulls a little bit further west, that would allow for a northerly flow to come down. And that could bring us a little cold spell. And that might be more significant as we move into December. Should the MJO move into phases that are favourable for colder weather. The global drivers, let's explain this one because there's a number of factors that play out in the planet that can influence our weather. whether one is more dominant than the other, we just have to wait and see, essentially. And that's what I'm trying to figure out for the winter forecast. I think with La Nina, if it's a central based, then it can allow for an unsettled picture for the UK. Also, sea surface temperature anomalies in the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean, the Northern Pacific Ocean, basically much warmer than normal. And the warmer waters will aid convection, allow low pressure areas to really deepen, and allow rain to become quite heavy when it occurs. So I'm wondering if that's going to be a driving force. The MGO is very influenced by where La Nina is going to sit as well, as we discussed a little bit earlier, when you've got the colder waters in the central Pacific Ocean, the equatorial region, that could prevent the MGO from moving into that region because the colder waters suppress convection. So, and also in the Atlantic, we've got a slight signature for a tripole. That's when there's warmer waters to the south of Greenland, colder waters off the Baffin Straits, and the kind of cold blob in the centre of the Atlantic, and then warmer waters for the tropical Atlantic. Now, if that was to develop, then you will hear me talking about cold weather over the winter. Because it tends to promote a more blocked signal for the same reasons that the cold water tends to suppress convection and we tend to see high pressure setting up. And when it does that in the Atlantic and the North Atlantic as a northern blocking feature, that's when we can pull down some northerly or easterly winds. There is another global telecommunication known as the Indian Ocean Dipole. And at the moment, we've got a very strong negative Indian Ocean dipole. That means that the waters on the western side of the Indian Ocean are cold or cold relative to the eastern side, where they are much warmer. That can set up a cold winter pattern. And that's not going to go away. That's definitely a driver that is in favour of colder weather this winter. There's a few other interesting things going on as well. We've got an easterly QBO quasi-Biano oscillation, and that's looking at the flow once again over the equator, but this time up in the stratosphere. So just the layer above where weather happens, the troposphere, the next layer up, the stratosphere, and the flow being easterly, what that can do is disrupt the polar vortex. So the polar vortex is really, well, usually getting going at this time of year, and that's what drives storminess in the North Atlantic. And essentially, a strong polar vortex is an area of winds that circulate the pole and the stratosphere. And when it's really strong or the winds are blowing very strongly, it tends to bottle up all the cold over the pole. So you get more sea ice. And the mid latitudes, like the UK, tend to be influenced more by westerly winds. So it is a westerly circulation. But what we've seen this autumn, something quite interesting, is a much reduced polar vortex. It is currently ramping up. It's been well below average, but it's currently ramping up. But all the models are forecasting it to dip and dip quite significantly as we move through November and into December. The easterly QBO can essentially disrupt the strong polar vortex and therefore allow for more cold to get out of the Arctic and seep down into the northern latitudes. So North America, Canada, for example, Europe, especially Northern Europe, or Asia, where we could have some cold outbreaks. So that's definitely something to keep an eye on, because if that pattern was to continue, then we could have some cold snaps, some dry, crisp, frosty weather, but also possibly a little bit wintry weather. We don't really get much wintry weather, and I would like to emphasise that too. Even if it's a little bit colder and we have some northerly outbreaks, with the sea temperatures well above average, the cold's always modified. And last year we saw that, in fact, late winter and early spring, we did have easterlies, but it wasn't beasterly easterlies because there was no snow cover over Europe. and western parts of Russia. So when the winds were coming in from the east, they didn't have the same bite as they normally were. They were chilly, if you remember, but they weren't cold, not severely cold, and nothing that would promote a beast from the east. It's interesting, isn't it? All these factors. So, if I talk about it being a little bit colder or the potential for snow, it's not like it used to be. The last time we had a run of cold winters was 08, 09. Oh 07, 08 was the beginning of it, to be honest with you, especially from mid-January until the middle of March, where there was quite a lot of snow. My location, Saltcoats, had snow fall every day during February that year. And I remember coming home from working at the college and building a new snowman almost every day. I had a whole snow family sitting on the decking. And when it eventually melted, all you could see was hats and carrots and sticks. It's been a while, eh? The following winter was quite severely cold. 08, 09. I know that snow began to lie in the ground during November and it did not melt until February, so that was quite cold. And we all remember the famous winter of 2010. Again, the snow started in November, but this time it kind of began to modify and the weather got milder during January. But it was such a brutally cold December, the coldest December we had for hundreds of years. Very interesting. And then we had another one, another really cold winter in 2012-13. And what caused that one was a sudden stratospheric warming, which started on New Year's Day in 2013. And we had some snow on and off and cold spells on and off from December, but it really ramped up when it came to late February and into March. And it was one of the coldest Marches ever recorded in the UK. It just goes to show you that we can get some cold from time to time. But then 2013-14 was a very wet and windy winter with just a few cold spells. 2018-19, that was probably our last cold winter, and it was on off cold in November. We got sort of like northerlies from time to time. We got some wintry showers, we got some frost, and of course we had the beast from the east at the end of February and into March. We had the Mark II, and then we had the mini beast that followed that too. It was a really cold Easter time, and out of sync with the seasons, really. So sudden stratospheric warming caused those two cold winters, and there is a chance of an SSW event happening this year. You look at the stratospheric charts just now. There is a little hint and a little suggestion that there could be an early one, and there's not been an early one for a while. And a sudden stratospheric warming event is when temperatures in the stratosphere rise by about 60 degrees within a couple of days. And that parcel of warm air then begins to sink down. And as it sinks down into the troposphere, and it's got to go down into the troposphere, it does a couple of things. It reverses the zonal winds. So the polar vortex that spins west starts to spin east. And we get an easterly setting up, but that also sets up high pressure over the pole. And as the high pressure becomes more established towards Greenland or Scandinavia, it brings in the winds from the east. And every now and again, it would channel that wind all the way from Siberia. So we're looking for all those things for the winter forecast. I think the fact that the seas are so warm is going to really it's going to be a struggle for us to get a cold winter. But there are signs that there could be, and if it were 20 years ago, then I would be sitting here telling you a very different thing. That there's a real possibility of cold weather. Some of the models have hinted at a kind of front-loaded winter, and I think that's where I'm sitting at the moment. Where most of the wintry weather happens earlier on in the winter. And that's true of La Nina, for example. But with the easterly QBO and the negative Indian Ocean dipole and a number of those other drivers favourable for a colder winter, should we get an SSW, a sudden stratospheric warming, then that could influence the weather a little bit later on in winter. I hope you found that interesting. You can let me know. It's kind of nice to speak it because I can explain it then rather than write all this jargon up for you. But yeah, I've got a month to nail the winter forecast. I'm going to release it actually at the end of November. And I never just look at models, the anomalies or the seasonal charts. That would be really limiting, to be honest with you. But we just have to see which global drivers are stronger and which winds are competing against and what winds are going to influence the weather here in the UK. I have no doubt that the Northern Hemisphere will have some cold spells this winter, but it's where the cold comes out of the Arctic. Because it could happen in America, and sometimes when it happens in America, it doesn't happen here in the UK. Most of us think that the American weather just whistles across the Atlantic, but it's not always the case because the cold air plunging down from the Arctic into Canada and then into North America can then meet the warm subtropical Atlantic and cause a big temperature differential. When that happens, we really, really ramp up the jet stream, which just makes a beeline between Scotland and Iceland. And that's when we get the mild southwesterlies. That's where Melissa's kind of going. And that's why we're having the weather that we're having just now and going to have this week. I hope you enjoyed that. I'll let you go now. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, and I hope to see you again soon. Thank you.